Well, things are heating up in Europe. Yes, I'm talking about the weather. Paris was, 104 or 105 degrees the other day. Denmark set records for heat, but also we now have a blonde on one side of the Atlantic and a blonde on the other side of the Atlantic. Well, at least one's a blonde, but the other one we got to figure out. It is time for the Media Beat with David Tereshchuk. David, of course, joins us on a Friday morning live. We rebroadcast him over the course of the weekend and in the 12 noon hour in the next week. Good morning and welcome back to the media capital of the world, David.
Yeah, I'm back in New York City after 3 weeks in Europe, yes. And you're right about the temperatures. I arrived in Italy 3 weeks ago at the back end of an extraordinary European heat wave. 101 degrees was what it was around me at that point. And I come back now to, a very hot New York, too. I'm very glad to be here because the New York temperatures have dropped just as the European temperatures are going up again. And it seems like Italy, Spain, France, and England, too, is getting, they're all getting temperatures way up in the 90s and sometimes popping into the century numbers, too.
You know, it's interesting. You take young people nowadays, if they read A Christmas Carol or you see anything with A Christmas Carol, London is bathed in snow. It was, and I think.
Well, my memories of earlier times is that London was always swathed in fog.
Yeah,
but now it's very, very different. You're right.
It really is. You're in trouble on the planet when you've got peat in Alaska self-combusting and causing fires because of the incredible temperatures in Alaska. So something's up somewhere. Well,
yeah, Alaska got record temperatures way beyond anything. I think 96 degrees was one figure recorded during the time that I was in Europe. It's extraordinary.
Absolutely.
Both sides of the Atlantic, we were well aware that who knows if it's actually global warming, evidence direct of global warming, but it's certainly evidence of climate change, climate sensitivity, climate unpredictability.
All right. Now, speaking about unpredictability, let's go on to really the big story really is Boris Johnson, and he is now the prime minister. Now you've got Brexit. You've got between now and Halloween. You've got Northern Ireland and Ireland mixed in that. This is a lot of work to get done in a very short period of time, and it's got more consequences than just the business side when you throw in Ireland and Northern Ireland.
Absolutely. Brexit is supposed to be a done deal finally on Halloween. Is it trick or is it treat? That's the big question, I guess, in some people's minds. But overall, the question is whether there will be a deal between Britain and Europe. I mean, it's going to be a divorce. It's a final, the declaration of a divorce that date, October 31st. But is there an agreement likely? It looks more and more unlikely at the moment. Which leads many people to fear chaos. We've already got some taste of it when there was a customs glitch, if you like, between England and France not long ago, and there was this horrific sight of a huge slice of southern England as the roads get towards the main port, which connects with France on the other side of what we the Brits call the English Channel, and the French call La Manche, just meaning the sleeve, I guess, because it looks a little bit like a sleeve. But all the roads running down to the English port of Dover were clogged with trucks. And that's some kind of, for many people anyway, some kind of premonition of how things might be if we don't get a worked out deal between Britain and the 27 countries that make up the EU, which were supposed to be leaving on that dread date. What is it going to be like if there's no deal arranged, no details worked out for the actual new regime of Britain being no longer part of the customs union that they were always part of since 1974?
And another thing that most Americans of a certain age have no idea of what went on in Northern Ireland and the violence. You just hate to say it, just like most Americans of a certain age have no idea about Vietnam and things like that. The big thing to me about Brexit is what it can do to, I don't know, to the it's not really fragile, but it could become a very fragile peace if Brexit can't be solved.
Yeah, you're right. There's a peace agreement that's been in force, ending those decades of violence in Northern Ireland, which are very fundamental to my own journalistic life. I essentially became a journalist through what the Irish call, in their sort of slightly euphemistic way, the Troubles. Thousands of people killed over decades lasting from 1968 through till 1997. And since then, that agreement has been in place. It's called the Good Friday Agreement because, running down to a deadline, the various sides all came together and signed an agreement. Astonishingly, at the time, it was an extraordinary piece of example of peacemaking, the practicalities of which were led by an American, Senator George Mitchell, the former leader of the Senate, the U.S. Senate, and he was appointed by the British government at the suggestion of Bill Clinton, president here at the time. And that agreement you're probably right not to describe it as fragile, but it's certainly come under pressure lately. There is no independent executive for Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland effectively doesn't have a working government at the moment because of things that have happened to challenge that peace agreement in recent years. Nothing to do with Brexit, but now along comes Brexit and puts in a horrible new threat to it. People in England too, as well as America, probably don't realize the size of the threat or the deep nature of the threat. It's Boris Johnson himself has been known to kind of minimize what the problem is. But the problem is, to put it simply, and it's very dangerous to try and simplify Irish questions, as you know, but essentially, one of the things that the peace agreement did was make the border between Northern Ireland, which is constitutionally part of the United Kingdom, completely border-free, although there is a line drawn between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, which is an independent state, and it was able to be made invisible and taken out of the contentious equation of Irish violence and contention, because Ireland and the United Kingdom were both members of the European Union. Well, now, after October 31st, Northern Ireland, because it's part of the UK, will no longer be part of Europe. So, logic decrees there needs to be a border. The customs arrangements will be very different in each country, in each part of the island. And that very, a border that was fought over for decades is now being reasserted in one form or another. The whole argument of Brexiteers who are in favor of this exit from Europe is, of course, that we won't have a very obvious border, but the Irish know. And they know which side of the border they're on. And I was interviewing the Prime Minister of Northern Ireland last year, and he said the most minimal kind of border arrangements are going to be a problem. And he took me through, in remarkably granular detail, extraordinary for a politician in office, I think. But the Irish Taoiseach, which is the name they give to the office of Prime Minister, explained that even if it's something as minimal as a camera on the borderline, taking photographs of trucks' license plates so that they know which what consignments have gone either north or south across that borderline. Even if it's as minimal as that, numbers to link up with numbers that are agreed upon in records for shipping and receiving at either side. Even if it is such a minimal thing as a camera, that will become, in his words, a target in the minds of certain people who are offended by the whole notion of a border. He's talking about extreme Republicans, the descendants of the violent IRA, people who were one side of the struggle, the violent struggle through the 1970s to the 1990s, if that happens, if it becomes a target, then it will need protection, and that protection will take the form, no doubt, of some kind of security emplacement. That too, he said, will then become a target, and we'll be back to the same old stuff that was killing people and destroying property to such a horrible extent in Northern Ireland before the peace agreement. And, he's a responsible politician. He's not an alarmist. That's exactly the kind of thing that he's fearing. So you're right to see that as a non-economic, sort of real life, as it were, a threat brought back again to what is currently a peaceful situation by I would posit irresponsible and incomplete thinking about what Brexit means.
I was watching BBC last night, or early in the evening, and they were interviewing the ambassador, the Irish ambassador, and he was saying, I don't want people to misinterpret me. The flow of people across that border is not the problem, is what he was saying. That's not going to stop. But when you all of a sudden, when you just hit upon what he obviously repeated, when you start to add having to check trucks and vehicles and shipments and cameras, and all of a sudden that is a step back on a slippery slope that nobody really wants to go.
It's a step back into a violent history towards the same kind of arrangements that could cause the problem in the first place. Going back to, and of course all Irish trouble goes back into history. In this case, we're going back to the fateful drawing of that line back in 1921, when it became the source of all the trouble in Ireland.
Now, let's talk a little bit about how did you think Boris Johnson's first couple of days, his first speech went?
Well, we now, as you say, have a blonde leader. A platinum blonde in his case, as opposed to whatever kind of blonde Donald Trump is. Carrot blonde was the phrase I heard yesterday. And he strikes an interesting figure. Not an entirely serious figure. I think that's the kindest way to put it. Boris Johnson has owed his career to being a funny man in many ways. On radio and on television, he got a reputation as a quick wit, which he is. For many people in Britain, it's very hard to take him seriously. However,
they have to now.
They have to now. The Conservative Party has taken him seriously enough to appoint them his leader. And
how many seats does he have?
It's a parliamentary democracy in Britain, and not a direct election, presidentially kind of a presidential kind of government. It means that the leader of the party with the biggest number of seats in Parliament is, generally speaking, the person who becomes Prime Minister. So, yeah,
David?
We have Boris Johnson as Prime Minister now. It's a serious matter, and we have to take it seriously, whether we like it or not.
What's his majority?
His majority, in what sense?
How many Conservative seats versus?
Well, it's razor thin.
Yeah.
It's razor thin. He has inherited a situation from his predecessor, Theresa May. They're supported entirely by a handful of members of Parliament who come from Northern Ireland,
Exactly.
ironically enough. But on the other side of the argument, from the Republican standpoint, that Republican in the Irish sense, that position which is so deadly against the border, the Protestant, essentially Protestant, although the religion is not part of their title, although it's very much part of their identity. The Democratic Unionists, so-called, in Northern Ireland, the ones who side with the Conservative Party in London, are unionist in the sense that they want to continue the link to the inclusion in the United Kingdom. They want to be part of this union, which is the United Kingdom.
So
and they keep the Conservative Party in power. So if there's any real problem that prompts them to start to lose faith, and they're, obviously in this situation there's a considerable chance of there being such problems, he will have no majority at all in the House of Commons, and therefore will be forced to call an election and run the risk of losing the power that he now has.
Or it seems
or winning it again.
I was just going to say that everything. What one tends to look backwards, extrapolating forward, and it's a really.
What else can we do?
Well,
we have history to base our predictions of the future on, but of course it so often doesn't guide us very well. Nobody knew, for instance, that the referendum that got us into this current situation, the referendum on whether the British public wanted Brexit, was a total surprise to the politicians who arranged it in the first place.
And that is the crux of my point. It's like once you get into the echo chamber and the certainty, and you stop talking. I mean, when I say stop talking, I understand that people have constituencies that they're supposed to go back to, but humans, I think, by their very nature, tend to, like tends to like. So.
Oh, sure, yes.
There's no real way, unless you are truly interested in listening, to get this is something that just always baffles me, because when people are running around, cannot believe this happened, I am frequently in a position where it's like, how could you have missed every single signal? And sure. I erroneously ascribed that responsibility to the press, which of course, as I say, erroneously.
Well, they're part of the mix, and I think they reflect. Certainly in Britain, the press is remarkably partisan compared with serious press, at least in America, and they go pretty much. This is a very unfair generalization, but there's a kernel of truth in this. That the press is part of the bubble in the British press, especially the tabloid papers, are very much part of the bubble that you're talking about centred on the Palace of Westminster in London, where Parliament sits, and where all the government offices are as well. You can't absolve the press from the responsibility that they have of their job is to not be part of that bubble. Their job is to be independent and ask the independent probing questions. Yeah. And that's clearly what they have not been doing over the last 2 to 3 years. Now we have arrayed ranks of British media. On the one side, there's a paper like the Daily Express that I think is welcoming this whole crisis atmosphere as if it's World War II all over again. The capacity of certain sectors of British society to hark back to World War II is extraordinary. Heroic times for Britain now. That on the one hand, and on the other hand, other examples of the press who are, determined to paint the picture as one as so horribly bleak and threatening that not just the Northern Ireland situation, but the economic situation in England and Scotland too, a very unwilling part of the mix, by the way, is also dire that it's some kind of cataclysm coming. And the overheated nature of the debate, and that's what it is, in the UK is pretty horrific, and the press carries a great responsibility for that.
And slightly tangentially, going back to the Irish situation for a second, apropos the press, is there any sort of solution, quote, quote, or is there any sort of bare bones agreement that could be expounded upon and perhaps worked through? Or
there is in existence already an agreement as part of the agreement that Theresa May negotiated with Europe, which she has not, which she never was able to get parliamentary approval for, which is important for any. Well, which is essential for any new legislation in Britain. There is what is called the oh God, what is it? It's got a sporting analogy as a title.
The backstop?
The backstop, yes. The whole argument, it's very technical, and it's all to do with customs arrangements and where you draw the line about where a declaration must, it's very obvious when you arrive in a new country or an airport and you walk through customs, that's where you declare your goods. The whole idea now is to be very, very fuzzy about where the line is drawn for goods moving around one side of Ireland or the other. Do you draw the line in the Irish Sea, that body of water that separates England from Ireland, or elsewhere? And there is the possibility of making the backstop work in some long-term way. But we come back to the problem of this handful of Protestant, far right in many ways, politicians who control the fate of the Conservative government in London, the Northern Irish Democratic Unionists who say, no, absolutely not. The whole point about the having a backstop is that it threatens our sovereignty. The whole idea of there being some kind of fuzzy get-out robs us of our status as part of the United Kingdom. And so they could torpedo that very easily.
And presumably not everyone in the, let's call it Labour Party, but that, there are obviously other groups, is pro-Remain.
Well,
does a different prime minister?
The Labour Party is the official opposition to the Conservative government, but the point is that the Labour Party is riven every bit as deeply as the Conservative Party and cannot come to an agreement about what is the right thing to do. There's more and more push from those very substantial numbers of people in the Labour Party, in Parliament in particular, who do favour Remain. And if they could offer themselves to the country in a general election, it's possible that they may, pin their promises to the mast. They could say that here's our platform, and our platform is to stay in Europe. If they could find the cojones, if you like, to do that, it's possible that you might have a real opportunity offered to the British people to take stock after 3 years of the chaos that we've had, and perhaps say, no, we're thinking again. Perhaps we've got ourselves into a mess, and it's time to get ourselves out of it. That could be the argument of Remainers, but I fear it's very unlikely.
But conversely, what I'm wondering is, can the Conservative Party pick off, just in terms of majority, in terms of voting for something. I'm just wondering if if changing the person atop the heap permits certain people within that riven other party, the Labour Party, to vote with the Conservatives.
Well, part of the hope of choosing Boris Johnson in the first place is that his supporters have argued that he's the one who can win another popular election. And that might persuade some Labour people to come over to him. But it's such a messy it's a messy situation. I wouldn't dare to predict that that's likely.
Right. No, I understand. I was just trying to see if there was an existing path that no one was talking about, and the answer appears to be no. Marshall, you had a question?
Not yet.
No, I just wanted to point out before we wrap up that to people out there saying, well, what are you guys here in America sitting here talking about Brexit for? Because, and the reason is because so goes Brexit, so goes world trade.
But moreover, the fantasy, it used to be called a Chinese wall in business, ha. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said ha. Just because it's like, okay, this department doesn't know what that department is doing. And that's the biggest joke ever. So, sorry, again, if I'm insulting people. So so goes. We are so interconnected in so many different areas, not just globally, that it's sort of irresponsible to just make arbitrary compartments. And that's all I'm going to say.
I think you'll find the upheaval caused by Brexit. The economic, the European Union is one of the largest economic groups in the world. In many ways, it's bigger than the United States. It's 28 countries, and the effect this is going to have on what, after all, is called global trade,
right,
is still to be seen and hard to predict. But I posit very firmly that it's going to be substantial.
Well, thank you very much, David Tereshchuk, the Media Beat. Boy, are we glad to have you back.
Glad to be here.